WS300 Flat College Advanced JavaScript Features ES6 and beyond. Mozilla, the makers of JavaScript, are constantly looking for ways to improve upon the language and come up with new things all the time. Every year, Mozilla creates new proposals for new features for JavaScript. They started out with ES6, then 7, then 8. Now they just add on the year that feature was added to the language. This list here is just a few of the items added. Check the link to see more specifics. Another thing to note is that it is up to the browser manufacturers to enact the standards, so some standards are slower to be enabled than others. You will have to check in the wide array of browsers. There's some really great stuff at the link, so check it out when you get a chance. We've seen this slide before. On day 1, I talked about the 3 different keywords to declare variables. Those are var, const, and let. Const and let were added with ES6 back in 2015, and their use is considered a best practice today. All of these descriptions about scoping and hoisting hopefully will become more clear in a moment as we discuss them. Scope is an important concept that manages the availability of variables. The short of what this means is whether or not we have access to the value of the variables we are referencing. Feel free to visit the link here to read more about scope. Dimitri does a really good job of explaining it. A number of programmers that came from other languages to JavaScript complained about the function-level scope of var, which is why the JavaScript developers added let and const to the standard. The block-level scope allows for better control of when variables are accessible by keeping them tightly scoped. A block scope is in the area between curly braces. For example, within an if statement, a switch, or in a for loop, or in while loops. Generally speaking, whenever you see curly braces, it is a code block. In ES6, const and let keywords allow developers to declare variables within the block scope, which means that those variables exist only within the corresponding block. Having your variables tightly scoped is considered a good practice in programming. The problem comes when we need to have access to a let variable outside of a set of curly braces. When you define a let variable inside an if statement, it is not accessible outside of the curly braces where it was defined. The following will demonstrate an example of that. Here is an example of function level versus block level scoping. The variable declared with the keyword var is available throughout the function. This is an example of function level scoping. Fruit gets hoisted to the top of the function and can be accessed outside of the curly braces where it is declared and initialized. A code block does not create a scope for var variables, but a function body does. Let me repeat that. A code block does not create scope for var variables, but a function body does. This is important to remember. Variables declared with the keyword let and const are only available between the curly braces of the area where it was declared. In this example, that would be our if statement. JavaScript does not know what those variables are outside of the curly braces where they were defined. So Apple gets hoisted to the top of the function, and we have access to it only within the function. Comment out the lines below and see what happens. Copy the code from here into the if statement within the curly braces and see what happens. See what happens when you put that before or after the declaration of the variable. There is a difference between undefined and not defined. Technically, variables declared with let and const are also hoisted to the top of their scope. But unlike variables declared with the keyword var, the variables are not initialized with a default value of undefined. Until the line in which they are initialized is executed, any code that attempts to access these variables' values will throw an exception. I know that in a previous slide I said that let and const do not get hoisted. Technically they do, but they in essence act as if they do not. Until you get really deep into this, it might be easier to think of them as not getting hoisted. If you want to understand JavaScript and its eccentricities, I recommend JavaScript, The Weird Parts on Udemy. Until ES6, there was only concatenation. Now we can do interpolation. You may hear this referred to by other names. Synonyms are template literals, template strings, string templates, and backtick syntax. Template literals use the backtick rather than the quotes to define a string. With template literals, you can use both single and double quotes inside of a string. Template literals allow multi-line strings. Template literals are not supported in Internet Explorer, but we hardly care about that now. In JavaScript, functions can be assigned to variables in the same way that strings or arrays can. They can be passed into other functions as parameters or returned from them as well. The best examples are the new methods associated with arrays. We will go over a few next. The ForEach method executes a callback function on each of the elements in the array in order. Here, the callback function containing console.log method will be executed 5 times, once for each element. The map method executes a callback function on each element in an array. It returns a new array made up of the return values from the callback function. The original array does not get altered, and the returned array may contain different elements than the original array, depending on how the function that map is using alters the content. The filter method executes a callback function on each element in an array. The callback function for each of the elements must return either a true or false. The returned array is a new array with any elements for which the callback function remains true. Here, the filtered array will contain all of the elements of random numbers except for the number 4. We've done a fair amount with functions. So much so, I expect you to have a basic understanding of them. Directly from the W3 schools, they say, a JavaScript function is a block of code designed to perform a particular task. Functions do things. This is why I recommend that you name them, such as in the first example. You give them an action-y kind of name, like a verb. A JavaScript function is executed when something invokes it, calls it. As we've seen in this class, this can be a wide variety of things, such as calling it by name, invoking it upon a click or some other event, or self-invoking. In JavaScript, a function is much the same as a procedure or a subroutine in other programming languages. Declared named functions do get hoisted. Expression functions do not get hoisted. Arrow functions also do not get hoisted. Arrow functions are function statements and not a function expression. In its most basic form, a function expression produces a value, while a function statement performs an action. ES6 arrow functions can't be bound to a this keyword, so when you use the keyword this, it will lexically go up a scope and use the value of this in the scope in which it was defined. It cannot reference itself, so you cannot use it with recursion. This is an example of an IFE, a immediately invoked function expression. When you are done with your code, you will want to encase your code in one of these. This keeps your variables protected and not manipulatable from the global scope. In other words, we can say an IIFE provides complete encapsulation of variables and functions. Enclosing your finished code in an IIFE is considered a best practice. The parentheses, also known as the grouping operator, encases the anonymous function in an expression. The parentheses at the end then invokes the function to run. This is just the tip of the iceberg. You can go deep with JavaScript. It is a robust language that has been around for over 25 years. Every year since 2015, Mozilla adds new features to ECMAScript and constantly tries to improve it. As always, I hope this lecture has been informative and enlightening, helping you understand JavaScript a little bit more. And I wish you happy coding!